Friends, there comes a moment in every sincere spiritual journey when words such as faith, belief, and practice quietly step aside. They do not disappear because they are wrong, but because they have carried us as far as they can. At that moment, something simpler and yet infinitely deeper stands revealed, and that revelation is contained in the understanding of I am. When I am is truly understood, it is no longer a phrase repeated in hope or desperation. It is no longer a declaration spoken by the personal mind trying to improve itself or secure a better future. It is recognized as the fundamental fact of being, present before thought, untouched by circumstance, and independent of human effort. The individual begins to sense that life is not something they must create, manage, or defend. Life already is. The first thing that happens is a quiet shift of identity. One no longer feels like a person trying to reach God, truth, or fulfillment. Instead, there is a dawning awareness that the presence one has been seeking is the very awareness looking out through the eyes. This recognition does not inflate the ego, it gently dissolves it. The personal sense of me loses its urgency, and with it goes the constant need to prove, protect, or perfect oneself. With this shift comes a surprising stillness. The mind, which once raced to solve every problem, begins to rest. Not because problems have been intellectually resolved, but because they are no longer granted ultimate authority. The understanding of I am reveals that conditions exist within consciousness, not as threats to it. Fear cannot survive where being is known to be whole and self-sustaining. Another transformation unfolds in the realm of action. One still works, speaks, and moves through daily responsibilities, but the strain of personal doership lessens. Action arises more naturally, guided by inner discernment rather than anxiety. Decisions feel less forced, and outcomes are met with greater equanimity, whether they align with personal preference or not. As this understanding deepens, prayer changes its nature. It is no longer a request sent outward, nor a mental effort to persuade a higher power. Prayer becomes a silent recognition, a resting in what already is. In this stillness, answers are not always given in words, but in clarity, timing, and an unexplainable sense of rightness. Ultimately, to understand I am is to stand on holy ground in the ordinary moments of life. It is to discover that peace is not earned, love is not manufactured, and supply is not produced by human will. They flow naturally from the recognition of being itself one. When I am is truly understood, the first and most profound change is the dissolving of separation, not as an idea to be accepted, but as a lived realization that quietly replaces the old sense of distance between oneself and life itself. Until this understanding dawns, most people move through existence feeling like observers standing apart from the world, from others, and even from God, attempting to bridge that distance through effort, goodness, prayer, or knowledge. The realization of I am reveals that this distance never existed. What one has been calling me and what one has been seeking as truth are not two different realities. There is a gentle awakening to the fact that being is already complete, already present, and already whole, without needing improvement or validation. This understanding does not arrive through intellectual reasoning or emotional intensity. It unfolds in quiet moments when thought subsides and awareness recognizes itself. In that recognition, the sense of a separate self striving to reach something higher begins to loosen. One sees that the same presence animating the breath, the heartbeat, and the awareness of thought is the presence that's been sought through spiritual effort. Life is no longer experienced as something external acting upon a vulnerable individual, but as a unified field in which the individual appears as an expression, not as a fragment. As separation dissolves, the inner conflict that once dominated experience begins to soften. There is less resistance to what is happening because there is less belief in an opposing force. Circumstances may still arise, but they are no longer interpreted as evidence of abandonment, punishment, or failure. They are seen as movements within consciousness itself, not as threats to identity. This shift removes the need to constantly defend, justify, or explain oneself, allowing a natural ease to take its place. Relationships also change under this understanding. Others are no longer viewed primarily as sources of approval or opposition, but as fellow expressions of the same life. Compassion arises without effort, not because one is trying to be loving, but because the illusion of separation that once supported judgment and comparison weakens. Even conflict is met with greater spaciousness, as one no longer feels personally endangered by difference or disagreement. Most significantly, the search itself begins to lose its urgency. The endless reaching for fulfillment in future moments gradually gives way to a recognition of presence here and now. There is a subtle but unmistakable sense of having arrived not at a destination, but in awareness itself. This does not remove activity from life, but it removes the burden of seeking completion through activity. Life continues to unfold, yet it does so from a center of being rather than from a sense of lack, and in that quiet recognition, the meaning of "I am" reveals itself not as a statement to repeat, but as the living truth of existence experienced directly and without division. 2. When I am is truly understood, the authority once claimed by the personal self begins to fade, not through struggle or discipline, but through simple recognition. The sense of being a separate individual in charge of life, responsible for making everything happen, slowly reveals itself as an assumption rather than a fact. What had seemed like personal will, personal intelligence, and personal control is seen as something borrowed, something that was never truly owned. In its place, a deeper presence is felt, not as an external power directing events from afar, but as the silent intelligence already animating thought, action, and perception. This shift can feel unsettling at first because the personal sense of self has long been trained to believe it must manage, decide, and protect in order to survive. Yet as this belief loosens, there is a surprising sense of relief. The weight of constant self-direction begins to lift. Decisions still occur, actions are still taken, but they no longer carry the same strain of personal responsibility. One notices that clarity often arises before the mind has time to analyze, and that right action emerges without the need for excessive planning or justification. As the personal self steps back, the inner dialogue that once dominated awareness becomes less compelling. Thoughts still appear, but they are no longer treated as commands that must be obeyed or defended. There is a growing trust in the quiet, knowing that operates beneath thought, guiding movement and response, with an ease that the analytical mind could never achieve on its own. Life begins to feel less like a battlefield of choices, and more like a flow in which one participates rather than controls. This surrender of personal authority does not result in passivity or indifference. On the contrary, action becomes more precise and effective because it is no longer distorted by fear, ambition, or the need for approval. When the personal self is no longer trying to secure its own future or protect its image, energy is freed for genuine engagement with what is present. Work, creativity, and service take on a different quality, marked by attentiveness rather than effort. Emotional patterns also shift as the deeper presence assumes its rightful place. Reactions that once felt automatic lose their grip, not because they are suppressed, but because they are no longer fueled by a threatened sense of identity. Anger, anxiety, and disappointment may still arise, but they pass more quickly, met by a spacious awareness that does not identify with them. This spaciousness allows experience to move through without leaving the same residue of struggle. Over time, a quiet confidence develops, not rooted in personal ability or achievement, but in trust in the underlying intelligence of being itself. Life is no longer approached as a problem to be solved by the individual mind, but as an unfolding guided by a wisdom far more reliable than personal control. In this recognition, the personal self finds its proper place, not as the ruler of life, but as a transparent instrument through which life expresses itself naturally and without strain. 3. When I am is truly understood, fear begins to weaken in a way that is both subtle and unmistakable, because the root from which fear draws its strength is quietly removed. Fear has always depended on a fragile sense of identity, an assumption that life is personal, limited, and exposed to forces beyond its control. As long as one believes that existence is something possessed by a vulnerable individual, fear appears logical and even necessary. But when I am is recognized as the ground of being rather than a personal label, fear loses its authority, not through resistance, but through irrelevance. This change does not mean that challenging situations disappear or that the mind no longer responds to danger or uncertainty. What changes is the meaning assigned to those experiences. Fear thrives on the belief that something essential can be lost, damaged, or taken away. In the understanding of I am, there is a growing recognition that being itself is untouched by circumstances. Conditions may fluctuate, relationships may change, and outcomes may remain uncertain, but the sense of existence remains intact and unmoved beneath these shifts. As this realization deepens, one notices that fear often arises as a habit rather than a response to present reality. Old patterns of worry, anticipation, and self-protection continue to surface, but they no longer feel convincing. There is a growing gap between the appearance of fear and the belief in its message. In that gap, fear is seen as a movement of thought rather than a statement of truth. Without the fuel of belief, it begins to dissolve on its own. This weakening of fear brings a profound sense of inner freedom. Choices are no longer dictated primarily by avoidance or self-preservation. One becomes more willing to remain present with uncertainty, to speak honestly, and to act according to inner clarity rather than external pressure. The need for constant reassurance diminishes, replaced by a quiet trust that does not depend on guarantees or outcomes. Fear of failure also begins to lose its grip. When identity is no longer anchored in personal success or recognition, mistakes no longer threaten one's sense of worth. Action becomes more natural and spontaneous, less burdened by the need to control how it will be perceived. Even the fear of spiritual inadequacy fades, as one realizes that being itself does not improve or decline based on performance or progress. Perhaps most significantly, the fear of life itself softens. The constant tension of anticipating what might go wrong gives way to a deeper acceptance of what is unfolding. This does not create recklessness or denial, but a grounded courage rooted in presence rather than optimism. There is an unspoken knowing that whatever arises will be met from a place deeper than fear, because awareness itself remains steady regardless of the forms that appear within it. When I am is truly understood, effort gives way to inner listening, and the constant striving that once defined the spiritual and personal journey begins to soften. Much of human effort is driven by the belief that something essential is missing and must be acquired through discipline, struggle, or relentless improvement. Practices, plans, and techniques are often approached as means to reach a future state where peace or fulfillment might finally appear. In the recognition of I am, this forward-leaning posture relaxes and attention naturally turns inward, not to search but to listen. This listening is not an activity of the mind, nor is it a method that can be perfected. It is a receptivity that arises when the urge to control diminishes. One becomes more aware of the subtle movements of intuition, timing, and insight that were previously drowned out by mental noise. Instead of forcing answers, there is a willingness to remain still long enough for clarity to emerge on its own. This stillness is not passive, it is alert and alive, grounded in presence rather than expectation. As effort recedes, one notices a change in how challenges are met. Problems that once triggered immediate analysis and reaction are now held in awareness without urgency. The compulsion to fix everything at once weakens, allowing space for understanding to unfold. Often what appeared complex resolves itself when the mind steps aside, revealing that much of the struggle was created by resistance rather than by the situation itself. This shift also transforms spiritual practice. Prayer, meditation, and contemplation cease to be tools for achieving a result and become expressions of communion. There is less concern with doing them correctly and more attention to the quality of presence brought to them. Even ordinary activities begin to carry this same quality of listening. Walking, working, and conversing are infused with a quiet attentiveness, as though life itself is being allowed to speak through each moment. Inner listening fosters trust, and trust gradually replaces anxiety. When one is no longer relying solely on personal effort, there is a recognition that guidance does not have to be manufactured. It is already present, arising as needed in response to each situation. This does not eliminate responsibility, but it changes its nature. Responsibility becomes responsiveness rather than control, an openness to what is being asked of the moment rather than an attempt to impose one's will upon it. Over time, this way of being brings a sense of alignment that effort could never produce. Actions feel timely, words feel measured, and rest feels deserved rather than earned. Life flows with fewer internal obstacles, not because circumstances are perfect, but because there is less interference from the anxious mind. In this atmosphere of listening, the understanding of I am reveals itself not as a concept to be practiced, but as a living presence that guides without force and sustains without demand. 5. When I am is truly understood, the way problems are perceived undergoes a fundamental transformation. What were once seen as solid, threatening realities begin to reveal themselves as appearances within consciousness rather than forces standing outside of it. The human tendency has always been to meet problems as enemies to be defeated or puzzles to be solved through mental effort. This approach reinforces the belief that life is divided into opposing powers, with the individual positioned as a small self struggling against circumstances. In the recognition of I am, this opposition quietly dissolves. This does not mean that difficulties vanish or that one becomes indifferent to challenges. Instead, there is a shift in relationship to them. A problem is no longer immediately personalized as evidence of failure, punishment, or lack. It is observed as an event arising within awareness, much like a thought or a sensation. This observation alone weakens its grip, because identification is what gives problems their apparent weight. When awareness remains unentangled, the situation is allowed to be seen more clearly, without distortion by fear or resistance. As this clarity grows, one notices that many problems lose their urgency when they are no longer fed by mental struggle. The constant replaying of scenarios, the projection of worst outcomes, and the emotional charge attached to them begin to subside. In that space, insight often appears unexpectedly. Solutions arise not from forceful thinking, but from a deeper intelligence that sees connections and possibilities the anxious mind could not perceive. Even when an outer solution does not immediately present itself, there is an inner stability that prevents the problem from overwhelming the sense of being. This perspective also reveals how many problems are sustained by belief rather than by fact. When awareness rests in I am, assumptions are more easily recognized and questioned. One begins to see how much suffering has been created by interpretations layered upon simple events. As these interpretations fall away, what remains is often manageable and far less threatening than originally imagined. There is also a greater willingness to allow situations to unfold without premature intervention. This does not imply neglect or passivity, but patience. Patience rooted in trust allows life to reveal its own movement. Often what seemed like a problem resolves itself through timing, change, or understanding without the need for constant interference. This patience is not learned. It arises naturally when one knows that being itself is not at risk. Over time, a deep confidence develops in the capacity of awareness to meet whatever appears. One no longer feels defined by the presence or absence of problems. They come and go within the field of consciousness, while the sense of I am remains untouched. This recognition brings a quiet strength, an ability to stand in the midst of uncertainty without collapsing into struggle, knowing that clarity and resolution are not produced by force, but revealed through presence. 6. When I am is truly understood, life begins to unfold through surrender rather than control, and this surrender is often misunderstood until it is lived. It is not the resignation of a defeated will, nor the abandonment of responsibility. It is the recognition that the deepest movement of life cannot be directed by personal effort, because it was never personal to begin with. Control arises from the belief that the individual self must secure outcomes in order to survive or be fulfilled. Surrender arises when that belief softens and trust in the intelligence of being itself takes its place. At first, surrender may feel like uncertainty. The mind, accustomed to planning and predicting, resists the idea of not being in charge. Yet as surrender deepens, a surprising stability emerges. One notices that even without constant mental oversight, life continues to function with remarkable precision. Needs are met in unexpected ways, guidance appears at the moment it is required, and obstacles often redirect rather than block the unfolding path. This does not happen through passivity, but through alignment with what is already moving. As control loosens, the body and mind experience relief. The tension created by constant vigilance begins to fade. There is less urgency to fix, improve, or manage every detail. This relaxation does not diminish effectiveness, instead it enhances it. Actions taken from surrender tend to be simpler, more direct, and more appropriate to the moment. Without the interference of fear or ambition, energy flows more freely and effort becomes lighter. This way of living also transforms expectations. When one is no longer trying to force life into preconceived outcomes, disappointment loses much of its sting. Outcomes are met with openness rather than judgment, allowing one to learn from experience rather than resist it. Success is appreciated without attachment, and difficulty is faced without despair. Both are seen as movements within a larger unfolding that does not threaten the essence of being. Surrender also deepens trust in timing. The impulse to rush or delay according to personal preference weakens, replaced by a sensitivity to when action is ripe. There is a growing respect for pauses, for periods of apparent inactivity, recognizing them as part of the same intelligence that governs movement. This trust reduces anxiety and fosters patience, not as a virtue to be practiced, but as a natural expression of alignment. Over time, surrender reveals itself as a form of freedom rather than limitation. Freed from the burden of control, one participates in life with greater presence and ease. There is a sense of being carried rather than driven, guided rather than pushed. In this way, the understanding of I am expresses itself not as withdrawal from life, but as an intimate cooperation with it, allowing existence to unfold according to a wisdom deeper than personal intention and far more reliable than effort. Conclusion: in the end, the understanding of I am is not an achievement added to the personal self, but a revelation that gently removes what was never true. It shows that life has never been fragmented, threatened, or incomplete, only misunderstood through the lens of separation and control. As identity shifts from the personal sense of me to the quiet awareness of being itself, fear loosens, effort softens, and surrender becomes natural rather than forced. Problems lose their power to define, actions arise from listening instead of striving, and trust replaces the need for constant certainty. This understanding does not withdraw one from life, it returns one to life as it is, unburdened by the illusion of isolation. Ordinary moments take on a depth once reserved for rare spiritual experiences, and peace is recognized not as a reward for effort, but as the underlying state that was always present. To live from aim is to discover that nothing essential needs to be defended, improved, or attained. What remains is a quiet confidence, a steady presence, and a freedom that does not depend on conditions, revealing that the truth sought through many paths has always been the simple fact of being itself.